Hello, and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we'll travel back in time to the 62nd Academy Awards, which awarded the films of 1989. 3 years after winning Best Picture and Best Director for his anti-war film Platoon, Oliver Stone was back with another Vietnam War film, Born on the 4th of July, about the real-life story of Ron Kovic, a paralyzed veteran who became an anti-war activist after his return home. The film became a frontrunner early in the race, winning 4 Golden Globes including Best Picture Drama, but it was the decidedly lighter Driving Miss Daisy that wound up taking the Best Picture prize at the Oscars in the end. And yet Oliver Stone did take home his second Best Director prize that very same night. So why did Born on the 4th of July fail to win Best Picture? And where the hell was Do the Right Thing? We'll explore all this and more as we discuss how the Oscar almost went to Born on the 4th of July. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I am your host, Kevin Jacobson, and we have reached the 80s. We're out of the 90s, now we're in the 80s. Exciting times, very interesting decade. So to start things off in the 80s, I have a very special guest, one of the most loyal listeners of And the Runner-Up Is, and one of my favorite people with Next Best Picture, Mr. Josh Parham.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to dig into this year.
I am very excited as well. Oh man, there's a lot to talk about here. But first off, we are going to talk about the movie that I and many others very clearly believe was the runner-up in 1989 that lost to Driving Miss Daisy. And that film is Born on the 4th of July. So let's quickly get into a quick summary of Born on the 4th of July. It is based on the autobiography of the same name by Ron Kovic, a Vietnam War veteran. And the film tells his story from this young, idealistic teenager in the early 50s and 60s, feeling inspired to serve his country, to his experience in the Marines, where he fights in Vietnam and eventually becomes paralyzed. And after he comes back home to a rather mixed reception, he gradually becomes more cynical about the war to the point where he kind of turns into this activist against the war. And so the film was directed by Oliver Stone, who co-wrote the screenplay with Ron Kovic himself. And Tom Cruise stars as Ron Kovic, and some notable actors that pop up throughout the movie include Willem Dafoe, Keira Sedgwick, Tom Berenger, Frank Whaley, Jerry Levine, Raymond J. Barry, and Caroline Cava. And so Born on the 4th of July made $70 million at the US box office, $161 million worldwide, and it was nominated for 8 Academy Awards and won 2 of them, but not Best Picture. So, Josh, what are your thoughts on Born on the 4th of July?
Well, when I first saw this movie years and years ago, I remember really, really loving it. I think I was sort of going through an Oliver Stone phase at that time, and
As one does.
yeah, and it's perfectly good because he's a great filmmaker overall, and I was really into it. But I have to admit, going back and watching it again for this show, I was not as taken with it as I was when I first saw it. And it's one of those movies that I think is, to me, the definition of a movie you respect but don't really love all that much. I think it's
Mhm.
got all the elements there to make a great film. The performances are all really good, especially from Tom Cruise. The way that Oliver Stone directs the film is really solid. All the technical aspects are really, really good. But there's something kind of missing to this movie that I felt didn't really carry it all the way through. And I think what that element is that Ron Kovic's story, as portrayed in this film, is kind of lacking purpose, I feel like. You kind of see him go to war, he comes back, and you get the depression that he feels, the PTSD that he's going through. But I sort of feel like the movie wallows in that a little bit, and it struggles to make a point as to what his suffering is ultimately about. And then when it gets to that point with the political activism, I sort of feel it's a little too late. It's right at the very end of the movie.
Mhm.
So, I mean, overall, I enjoyed the film. I think it is very well done, but it is missing a little something extra that some of Stone's other movies, I think, really excel at.
Right. Yeah, well, I more or less agree with that. I think it is a very, very well-made film. I think the visuals are very striking, and there's a purposeful way that he uses the cinematography between the reds, the whites, and the blues that are obviously very intentional. And I think the success of this film kind of depends on whether you can fully believe the arc that he goes through from this very, very idealistic young man going into war because it's the right thing to do to eventually, still being a patriot, but also really heavily questioning the actions of the government and becoming this activist. And I do think that towards the end, it does become a little like, it goes too far in like that direction very quickly to the point that we don't exactly see exactly what would push him so clearly over the edge to becoming a protester, you know?
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, I do think that most of the film, while you're watching it, is incredibly engaging, and each little episodic point in Ron's story, I think, is very naturally compelling. And I think a lot of that falls on Tom Cruise, honestly. And, Tom Cruise is someone who we are now used to seeing more as an action star. Obviously, Mission Impossible, all of the different movies he makes now are very action based, not a lot of huge character exploration. And so, seeing this now, after having seen him in so many different action films over the past decade, is very refreshing. And I feel like this is absolutely one of his best performances. And it does have a certain physicality to it that he has become known for. And you could tell that he's really pushing himself. And so I think the Tom Cruise factor is like very high for me in terms of my enjoyment of the film. And I think it's one of these movies that totally sinks or swims on the caliber of the performance at its center because there's really like nothing else to latch onto if you can't fully believe him.
Absolutely. This is really one of his better performances. I do think, though, there are times where he can get lost in kind of the histrionics of the hyperbolic overacting a little bit. It kind of skews in that direction. And sometimes I think he's not completely in control of that. But for the most part, he does feel very believable in that transition. I think that him as an actor embodies that more so than the script does, because you're completely right. There's sort of these episodic chapters in Kovic's life, and going from a soldier with PTSD who's very aimless to political activist who's against the war feels very sudden. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
feel like the story itself particularly sells that. But
Right.
you do get that sold in Tom Cruise's performance. And this was like one of his first really serious, dramatic, take me seriously as an actor roles. And I think for the most part, he really, really does sell it. You're right. If you don't believe that performance, you're not going to really go with anything in this movie. And he's a great central figure to kind of carry this film for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we should talk about some of these little segmented episodes throughout the film because there's a lot of different like set pieces and different interactions going on. Let's just start first with some of the at home, the domestic scenes at the beginning. Because when I was watching this, after a while, it just became a little too like ridiculous in terms of the over the top idyllic Norman Rockwell esque like
Yeah.
feeling of, oh, we're in the 50s and 60s, just go down to the malt shop and here we're going to prom, and oh, I work at the grocery store and everyone's just having a great time, everyone is having fun, that sort of thing. It took me a little bit to figure out like if that was intentional or it was just too over the top and he overdid it. Stone, I'm talking about. um And I feel like, in a way, if you look at it just through Kovic's sort of perception of things, I think it does make sense that, like, if you look at it from him looking back on his life in a way, kind of like what I was talking about on the Bugsy episode, like
Yeah.
as far as like the idyllic youth of his past and how that's just totally gone now.
I definitely agree that the beginning felt very over the top, and sort of how this painting this portrait of idyllic Americana,
Mhm.
that is going to be contrasted later on in the film. Oliver Stone also is not the most subtle of filmmakers in general, so
Right.
it's hard to tell if that is intentional or if that's just the way that he sees it. I do think it's not the most engaging because it is just very introductory of this character and setting out that this is where he is, and looking at later on in the film where he changes. It's got some nice actors in that part of the film, but
Mhm.
I do admit I wasn't the most taken with how this movie starts. I think it kind of takes a little while for it to really gear up into the more interesting parts of the movie.
Right. Yeah, and it's something that you see quite a lot at this point in a lot of war films, even as recent as like Hacksaw Ridge, which I thought like the beginning of that was just borderline awful. But we see it all the time over and over. So when I'm just watching this now, it's just like, okay, well, we've seen all of this before, but it's fine. It's just very, very cliche at this point.
Yeah, it's there to set up this character, to set up the world that he's in, and for that, it serves its purpose, but it's not the most interesting part of the movie.
Right. And I do think it at least does introduce this idea that he was very, I guess you could say, narrow minded in terms of just his focus, like laser focused on just being this idyllic American masculine male who just naturally goes into the military. Like, everything in the beginning does make sense to set up that narrow minded kind of character to eventually have the payoff later of him kind of opening his mind and things like that. So, let's also just talk about the few little war scenes, which I was kind of surprised that there weren't as many as I was expecting towards the beginning to middle portion. And then ultimately, what happens is spoilers for real life, I guess. Ron Kovic gets his legs blown off, more or less, and so he spends a lot of time in this military hospital. I was actually really engaged with this part of the film, perhaps more than any other part. I don't know about you, but I
Oh,
was
with the
very gripped
military
by it.
hospital?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I was in this most recent rewatch. I was actually very surprised that I was feeling like I could watch a whole movie just about his recovery in the hospital. Because to
Mhm.
me, that's the one section of this movie that is very different from most movies that we get about Vietnam. Because obviously Stone had already directed a movie about Vietnam at this point.
Right.
I would say a superior film. So
Mhm.
as much as the scenes in the wartime in Born on the Fourth of July are well done, it is a little bit like, okay, well, we've seen you kind of do this before, Stone. You're not really showing me too much new right now. And when you get to the hospital, it's this whole different perspective that you just don't ever get to see in films, where you see the treatment of these soldiers and what they have to go through and how that is damaging to them both physically and mentally. And to me, that's the section where Tom Cruise really shines as an actor. And all of that was so fascinating to watch. I kind of wish that had been more of an extended sequence in this whole story, because I just found it fascinating.
Yeah, I definitely could have watched even more of this. And I think just the feeling of hopelessness that Ron just eventually gets to feeling is just so heartbreaking and compelling. And Tom Cruise absolutely plays it so well. And like I said, it's kind of not like other roles that he has taken. Just this level of drama and hopelessness, I think, is showing some new sides to him that I appreciate seeing. And once again, I would like to see more of.
Well, the other thing that happens during the war sequences that's important to the plot is that he ends up killing a fellow soldier,
Right. Correct.
and that factors very much into his PTSD and guilt. And it comes in this very, I do think it's a very well done sequence where they're attacking this village, and they think that there's enemy soldiers there, but then they find out that it's actually all civilians, and they just
A lot of children. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's a very upsetting scene, but very well executed at the same time, and those elements do carry into the rest of the film with him dealing with all of these mental issues. And again, is it the most revolutionary thing we've seen in a movie? No, but it is very well done and very effective for what it's showing you, certainly.
Right. And I agree that that scene where it actually leads up to, Ron accidentally shooting this fellow soldier. I think it's well done, it's well shot, it's well told, and Stone is able to really show you how this could have come to be, having it be in the sun, it's dark, it's hard to tell at this point. And so I think just that quick accidental thing can really just change your life. And I think it does do a really great job of showing the psychological trauma of that. So yeah, definitely just the middle portion of this film I think is super solid, very strong, and very haunting. And then we get home, we come home again, and he's in a wheelchair. So, what did you think of kind of the way that they show how there's this mixed reception to Vietnam now, and even people in his own family are not necessarily totally supportive of him, after this very big trauma that he's had of having, being paralyzed?
Yeah, this is the section of the movie where I go back to that respect more than like sentiment, because all of these elements are here that I do find usually pretty engaging. Because yeah, this story about how he comes back and there's a different reception to war and war veterans and how he's battling that with the town and his friends and his family is all very very engaging on the surface. But I think the issue that I run into is just the movie never really says too much more than that. And there's nothing really revealing about these interactions that he's having. And it eventually just comes down to a lot of yelling matches, which get old very quickly. you
Yeah.
know, I
Yep.
mean, as much as I might love to hear Tom Cruise yelling about his erect penis,
Mhm.
it doesn't really mean that I need to kind of have an extended sequence on that. And it just gets kind of draining after a while. And it's almost like, melodrama at that point, and not particularly engaging melodrama, I have to say.
Right. Yes, it does become very, very 50s melodramatic in terms of the sort of yelling back and forth that goes on and waking up all the neighbors. And, they're all like going
Yeah,
outside their houses to see what's going on at the Kovic house.
yeah. It's not. It's very traditional in terms
Mhm.
of like base dramatic storytelling and conflict, and yeah, it is also kind of out of the 50s, which you could kind of understand because that's sort of the era that his parents are living in.
Yeah,
But it's just sort of beating you over the head with it. And it's like, okay, we've seen this in a dozen other war films dealing with PTSD. I don't think it is saying anything particularly new or interesting, even at this time, almost 30 years ago when the movie came out. I think those conversations were already kind of stale by that point.
for sure. Yeah. And one other thing that I just took note of is just a small little moment, but it's either very over the top or very subtle, depending on how you look at it. But the scene where his mother is watching the anti war protests on TV and is kind of just disgusted by it because she's still very much supportive of the war. And then she just turns it over to laughing.
Yeah.
I just thought it was funny, even though I mean, you can obviously tell what he's doing there, which is kind of saying that some Americans just do choose to turn a blind eye to what's actually going on in the world sometimes. And, the idea of just tuning out the other side of an argument completely. So, I
Yeah,
don't
it's
know.
actually reminds me of something that Stone did in one of his later movies with Natural Born Killers, where you had Rodney Dangerfield as this really disgusting human being, this awful, abusive father and husband, but all of his lines have a laugh track to them. So, kind of
Yeah.
really juxtaposing this very hurtful language, but it's something that in other contexts we kind of just laugh at and brush off. So it's something that Oliver Stone, I think, kind of likes playing with, that juxtaposition of atrocities and horrors with mundane kind of laughter and absurdity of things that to just take your mind off of it.
Right. And this is something that he kind of plays with throughout in terms of just kind of the little ordinary moments in life that can be very traumatic, such as like, there's multiple parade scenes in the film, and they're like on the 4th of July, of course, and there are these military veterans going through, and a lot of the times they have these fireworks happening at the same time, which are very triggering, that it makes them flinch. Things like that, I think, are really interesting and subtle. And
Yeah, the crying babies in the crowd
yeah,
reminds him of the baby that was in the village. Yeah,
right.
it's a very well done sequence that uses the filmmaking techniques to amplify that feeling inside of his own head of this tension and the reliving of the trauma. And it's a very well done sequence. That
Mhm.
whole parade scene.
Yeah. And so I wanted to just talk about kind of the downward descent of Kovic and whether you fully believed it, and like, how he ends up, because we mentioned earlier how we don't fully believe like the full journey towards the end. What do you make of like the segments where he's either, going to visit the Kira Sedgwick character, or going down to Mexico and meeting with prostitutes and Willem Dafoe and all of that?
Well, the Willem Dafoe stuff, I have to admit, the whole stuff in Mexico, I thought was the worst part of the movie. I really just hated everything about that because, again, I don't really feel like it said much interesting. Certainly within talking about his depression and PTSD, because we'd already seen it by that point. It's
Yeah.
just a further spiral, and I mean, I love Willem Dafoe, but I don't know why he's in this movie other than just to yell at Tom Cruise. it's just
Yeah.
it just seems so unnecessary. Like everything in this section of the film just felt not needed at all. And I don't know why it's necessarily here because it doesn't propel the story any further. All it does is highlight stuff that we've already gotten a sense of. And what I wish had been there instead was more scenes with Kira Sedgwick and with
Mhm.
the anti protesters so that we could get more of a sense of his progression from being, sort of wounded by the war in both physically and mentally, but also kind of being supportive of it to understanding why this was bad, why you need to speak out against it. And I feel like they give you just a little taste of that, but
Mhm.
don't really explore it to the point where you can fully believe that transformation at the end. And I
Right.
wish that all that Mexico stuff was kind of jettisoned for more of that buildup with him working with anti war protesters, having arguments and discussions with them, and finding that gradual change within his character. I think that would have better served the movie.
Yeah, for sure. But I think some of that stuff in Mexico and that downward descent, I think, is maybe just trying to show kind of the way that the life course of a lot of veterans in this country eventually end up kind of just turning to alcoholism and becoming very bitter and feeling like they have nowhere else to go. And then, I mean, some of as far as where it goes, like into the prostitution and things like that, is a little bit shaky for sure. But
Yeah.
like in a way, like I understand how they're trying to kind of reinforce this idea of how he's lost his manhood, both physically and emotionally in many ways. Just kind of he feels dispirited by the notion of kind of the American dream that he grew up with.
Yeah.
Kind of feels neutered essentially.
And there is, I mean, an attempt at sweetness a little bit with this woman who,
I guess.
it's an attempt. I said it's an attempt. I didn't
Yes.
say it was successful, but
Right.
with this woman who is like trying to see him as not just a sexual object, but is trying to engage him on an intellectual, well, not really intellectual, but like an emotional level in
Right.
some capacity. Certainly something that he hasn't connected with before. And I can understand the movie trying to sort of say that here's somebody who thinks that he is like completely shut off in one part of his life, but here's somebody else that he meets who opens him up to those other possibilities. It's kind of undercut a little bit later when he goes back and is like falling in love with her and then gets mad because she's got another client and
Right. Even though
all.
that's kind of her job.
Yeah, that
But
part, it kind of makes it seem a little bit okay. Well, it does undercut it a little bit,
yeah.
but I can kind of see what the movie's trying to do. I don't think that setting and that character was the best way to do it.
Right. That's fair. And it also presents kind of Mexico in just as a really unflattering light, essentially. Just
Yeah,
like making it seem like this hellish nightmare where people just indulge in all their fantasies that I'm just
yeah,
like, okay.
it just feels like a nightmare world that's
Right.
just thieves and crooks and drunks and doesn't make it seem like a very appealing place, which I know that's sort of the mindset of these
Mhm.
characters, but it's just kind of unappealing to be there. And especially when you're struggling to figure out why we're even here in the first place, you just don't really want to stay.
Right. And then as far as the ending, we get to some real protesting happening, which again, I was also kind of expecting more of this based on just the premise itself and who this guy is as a person. But that really only comes to pass in like the last 20 or 30 minutes of the film.
Yeah, it's at the
Um,
very end of the movie, which
yeah,
because I it had been a while since I had last seen it, and I did think that there was way more of that protesting going on. And when I
right.
saw it again, it's like, oh, movie's almost over, and
Yeah,
he's not doing the thing that I thought was the purpose of this movie being made.
right.
And I think that was kind of the frustrating thing watching it because you are watching it thinking, okay, we're seeing all this trauma that he's going through because eventually it's going to turn into him being an anti-war protester, and that's going to be the importance of his life right now, but the movie never gets to that point until it's almost over.
Right.
And it's it's an interesting part of his life that I would have loved to have seen more of, but
Mhm.
it's just it's like it happens at the very end, and I sort of feel that's the reason why I should be watching this movie in the first place.
Right, because I think that's the most interesting part of who this person is to begin with and why we're telling this story.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a little bit frustrating there. But what did you actually make of how things end with him and everyone kind of protesting the Republican National Convention, where Nixon is going to be reconfirmed as the Republican nominee, and then eventually going to the Democratic convention where he's going to speak?
All of that is very interesting. I do like because this is the part where Ron Kovic is sort of like fully transformed. And
Hmm.
while I wish I could have seen a little bit more of that transformation, I do think watching him sort of fully inhabit this new role in life is very nice to watch. The speeches that he gives to the television crews, I think, is all very engaging, and Tom Cruise sells it really well. One of the things that I didn't like though is when it's at the very end of the movie when he's about to give a speech at the Democratic convention, and it flashes back to his mom years ago when she was saying, "Oh, watching who was she watching on the TV?
JFK.
JFK, yeah." And
Yeah.
she's saying like, "Oh, look, Ron, one day you're going to be up there talking to a lot of people." This is a little cringy to me, a little eye rolling,
Yep. Yep.
but overall, it's one of those things where it might not be the best executed, but the people involved are really selling it, and particularly Tom Cruise.
Right, I agree. And that specific moment you're talking about, I was like, well, here he is making that speech because I do remember that from the beginning. And I'm like, okay, well, here we go. It's fulfilling what his mother said would happen. Please don't just flash back to it. And then they actually do. And I'm like, ugh, you have to
Yeah,
have faith in your audience.
that actually makes me believe that the very over the top Americana of the beginning at the beginning of the movie probably wasn't intentional, because if it was,
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
think he would have flashed back to it to remind the audience that this is what the mom said. I think that is just the way he wanted to portray it.
Yeah. So once again, another little frustration.
Yeah.
um, But I do like the way that it ends, like literally how it ends, as far as just kind of cutting off right before he's going to give his big speech, because I think regardless of what he was going to say, we probably already knew the tenor of it to begin with. Um, and overall, I'm left with a pretty positive mixed to positive experience overall for the film, with a few little frustrations, as I said, kind of placed throughout the film that prevent it from being a true classic. Because I feel like this is a movie that isn't necessarily talked about or remembered on the same level as a lot of his films. And I think
Mhm.
I can kind of understand why at this point.
Well, I think the other issue with this movie, if you look at the totality of Oliver Stone's filmography, it's sort of sandwiched in between what I think are two superior films. You've
Right.
got Platoon, that is like one of the best Vietnam movies ever made, and then you've got JFK, which, if kind of regardless of your personal feelings about the subject matter, it just as a technical achievement is just leaps and bounds like above anything else that he's ever done.
Right.
And you kind of got Born on the Fourth of July here, and it's like it's good, it's well made, but it's talking in similar subject matter that he had already done previously, and doesn't really bring that much new to the table. It's technically proficient, but it isn't anywhere near as impressive as what he would do in his next movie. So it's just sort of sitting there, like, yeah, you're good, I like you, but you're not really anything exceptional.
Right. I think it's just a very solid entry in his filmography, and it's a good, I guess, like you say, a little bit of a good transition point where he can eventually do JFK and focus a lot of energy on that. But I will just say one other thing about this movie is that I actually really liked the score by John Williams.
Yeah, it's a very, very good score. The I do think one of the things with John Williams, though, is his music tends to blend together at a certain point, and
Yes.
even the good ones do tend to sound a little similar.
Mhm.
But for what it was trying to capture, that very patriotic feeling with sort of this darkish undertone to it,
Right.
I
A
think
little
he
bit
did it
of the
very well.
menace. Yeah.
Yeah, he did that very well.
Yeah, it's like kind of the same variation on the theme kind of throughout the movie that you just hear over and over again. But I think it makes it a little more epic and sweeping that you always call upon John Williams to do. So, do you have any other thoughts on Born on the Fourth of July before we get into its Oscar success and failure?
Mm. Just that again, I think this movie is solid. It's a good movie. There are a lot of elements in it that I think are kind of approaching the level of exceptional, but it is missing that extra spark to make it something truly spectacular. And I think a lot of that comes down to the way the story is constructed and emphasizing some things that I don't think are particularly as interesting as maybe the movie thinks they are, and not exploring those elements that would have given the film something different to say. So overall, good movie, but as you said, not really classic
Right.
status.
Yeah, but I would watch it just alone just to see Tom Cruise in a very interesting role. So,
Yes.
I highly suggest anyone just check it out and make up your own mind. So, when we come back, we'll be talking about why Born on the 4th of July lost Best Picture to a movie called Driving Miss Daisy.
Mm.
I wanted to be a good American. I wanted to serve my country. I couldn't wait to fight my first war.
We got him! We got him! Look out!
Let the word go forth.
Daddy, the soldier!
That the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
Your brother's a hard worker, Tommy. Win or lose, school, sports, life. As long as you do your best. That's what matters to God.
First off, young men, let's get one thing straight. There is nothing prouder as a United States Marine.
Our dad's got to go to WW2. This is our chance to do something.
You should think about what you're doing. You could get yourself killed. Did you ever think about that?
Help me, Jesus. Help me to make the right decision. Sometimes I just like to stay here and never leave. But I gotta go.
13,000 miles. It's a long way to go to fight a war.
Don't you know what it means to me to be a Marine, Dad? Ever since I was a kid, I've wanted this. I wanted to serve my country. I want to go to Vietnam. And I'll die there if I have to.
There's something happening here.
You gotta try and stay alive, okay? You hear me?
Ain't exactly clear.
Chicago has an Alice in Wonderland quality about it. Things are getting curiouser and curiouser.
Come on, get up there, get up there. Keep going, come on.
Stop, children, watch that sound. Everybody look what's going down.
And we're back. So now we're going to discuss why Born on the 4th of July lost Best Picture to Driving Miss Daisy. Born on the 4th of July was nominated for 8 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director for Oliver Stone, Best Actor for Tom Cruise, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, Best Original Score, and Best Sound. And it won 2 of those, one of which was very big. It was Best Director for Oliver Stone, which is part of why it's clearly a runner-up here. And also it won Film Editing, which is one of the most important technical precursors to get. And so before the Oscars, Born on the 4th of July actually won the Golden Globe for Best Drama, and it also won the Directors Guild. And meanwhile, Driving Miss Daisy won the Golden Globe for Comedy Musical, PGA, and the WGA for Adapted. So why do you think that Born on the 4th of July kind of stumbled here? Because this is a little bit of a race that we have, compared to others that I've been talking about recently. I think it was a little more up in the air.
It was a little bit more up in the air, but I also sort of feel like Driving Miss Daisy had captured the buzz at that time too, because like Born on the 4th of July, you mentioned it won the Globe for drama. It also won director, actor, and screenplay. Like
right.
it won a ton of Globes at that point. But Driving Miss Daisy did too. It won Comedy Musical Picture and Morgan Freeman and Jessica Tandy. So they were kind of split at the Globes. And while Born on the 4th of July did get the DGA award, as you said, Driving Miss Daisy had its own share of precursors in the industry as well. And I think that when it comes down to it, when you compare these two movies, especially in 1989, I think you've got a choice between one movie that you do like, but you might be thinking, well, Oliver Stone, you're kind of doing the same thing again. We like you, but it's sort of a bit of a downer too. It's very heavy, dramatic. And then you've got Driving Miss Daisy, which is also sort of talking about a potentially serious subject matter, but doing it with a much lighter touch.
Yes,
and
much lighter.
Yeah, much, much lighter. Plus, you've got the narrative behind Jessica Tandy, who had been nominated. She had a very long career without this kind of recognition. She was going to become the oldest Oscar winner for an acting prize at that point. And I think combining her narrative and how well the film was received in the industry, I think was just maybe something that really couldn't be overcome, despite how much respect there was for Born on the 4th of July. I think this is one of those cases where emotion just got the better of the Academy, and they just went for the film that they felt good about, and also kind of felt like they were making a couple statements at the same time. You're getting Jessica Tandy an Oscar, and you're rewarding a movie that does talk about race, maybe not in the way that some other people would have wanted, but it's sort of what they wanted to reward.
Exactly. I definitely think when it comes to these two films, I think both of them are making statements in some way about certain things. I mean, Driving Miss Daisy is predominantly centered on just this unlikely friendship, opposites attracting of sorts, but it does, kind of have themes about finding common ground and also having it all through the backdrop of racism in the American South. So it does touches on some important subject matter that I think Academy voters felt more than justified to say, okay, well, even though it's not like the most substantial movie there is, even in this race, it's still, I guess, just, weighty enough that we can feel comfortable rewarding it as Best Picture. So
yeah, absolutely. Although the one thing about Driving Miss Daisy that I will never really understand, even to this day, is how Bruce Beresford did not get nominated. I really just do not understand it, because we've seen directors get nominated for Best Picture nominees with far less buzz than Driving Miss Daisy had at that time.
Yeah.
And it's not even like he got nominated at a bunch of precursors and then suddenly Oscar comes up and he's replaced by somebody that they had more passion for. He didn't get nominated at the Globes, didn't get nominated at DGA. He got a BAFTA nomination a year after the Oscars when it didn't matter anymore. It just seemed like he was never even in the conversation to be nominated for this film. And for a movie that had such passion behind it, clearly, to not even get like the obligatory nomination of like your movie's winning Best Picture, so you're not going to win, but here's a director nomination anyway. For that even not to happen is so bizarre to me. I don't understand it.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I can really think of at this point is the fact that it's based on this play. And I think you can really kind of tell that it's based on a play. There's not a lot of big world building happening, and it's not super flashy, like in any way, I don't think.
No, not particularly.
But I do agree that it is very bizarre to have a Best Picture winner not even get nominated for director. It's the last time that it happened as of 89 was in 1932 with Grand Hotel. So it had
that
been
was its only nomination.
Right, exactly. So it's so exceedingly rare that it is just this bizarre little anomaly in Oscar history that would not happen again until Argo.
True, but I
For
feel like
different
in the
reasons.
case,
Yeah.
but in the case of Argo, it's almost like I don't want to say mistake, but it really feels like one of those situations where they thought Ben Affleck was going to be safe for a nomination, so they put other people ahead of him, and in that ranking system, those other people, the Ben Zeitlins and Michael Haneke's, squeaked by him, with their passion votes.
Right.
Here, Beresford doesn't even get like nominated in other places. That's what's so bizarre to me, is that it just seemed like this movie was so clearly in the position to win Best Picture, and yet the director wasn't even considered to even have a nomination. And the weirder thing about that, actually, to me, is it's not even like Beresford was a complete unknown, because he had been nominated for Tender Mercies a couple years ago by the director's branch. So he had a nomination before. I just do not understand why the season conspired against him to not be nominated. As Jessica Tandy said, the forgotten man in her Oscar speech.
Yeah. And even like Billy Crystal mentioned, did the movie direct itself?
Yeah.
He did that whole thing again. So yeah, I can't really explain it. I went to Inside Oscar, which is a very good resource for finding out what was happening exactly on the ground. And even then, it's like, we don't know how this happened.
Nobody knows.
Yeah, so to give people context, the nominees for directing were Oliver Stone for Born on the 4th of July, Peter Weir for Dead Poets Society, Jim Sheridan for My Left Foot. All of those movies were Best Picture nominees, but it was only 3 for 5 because the other nominees were Woody Allen for Crimes and Misdemeanors and Kenneth Branagh for Henry V. So very interesting combination of things happening here. I really can't explain it, to be honest. I mean, Crimes and Misdemeanors was very well reviewed and respected and considered one of Woody Allen's best, I think, after a while. And Henry V, I mean, I don't know. I don't particularly understand that particular nomination compared to Driving Miss Daisy. I mean, it's clearly more of a directorial achievement, I think, than Driving Miss Daisy, but just in terms of all of the factors in the race, you can't really explain it. So.
Yeah, I mean, Crimes and Misdemeanors, Woody Allen had kind of had a habit of getting nominated for Best Director and his movies wouldn't be up for Best Picture. That had happened quite frequently. And yeah, Crimes and Misdemeanors was a very well-reviewed film. So I can sort of understand that because it was a pattern that he was dealing with. And in terms of Henry V, that was really celebrated as like one of the best Shakespeare adaptations of all time, really. And I think that, I think that you can look at that film and see it as this really kind of monumental achievement of bringing Shakespeare adaptations sort of back into the popular culture and having them be very fiercely innovative and creative and really get people excited about them again. And I can understand wanting to reward that ahead of rather mundane direction of Driving Miss Daisy. I actually love the nomination for director for Henry V.
Yeah.
I'm a huge Kenneth Branagh fan, and of these nominees, he'd actually probably be my winner because I do think the way that movie is directed is really exceptional. And it does seem like one of those cases where just there was no enthusiasm for the direction of Driving Miss Daisy, which I can understand, but still talking about the Academy when, again, they've nominated directors for doing I think even much less for movies with far less steam than Driving Miss Daisy.
Right.
It just feels like this very strange anomaly that his nomination as a director never caught on.
Yeah, I don't understand it, and I would honestly take it personally if that happened to me.
Especially considering how consistent it was throughout the entire season. Like,
right. It's like, what's wrong with me?
Every time your movie gets nominated, you don't get nominated every single time. It does seem very odd to be in that spot.
And it's not like he's even a producer on the film to get nominated. You know, he did not win with the Best Picture. And he didn't write it because it's Alfred Ori's adapting his own play. So yeah, he just kind of walks away saying, okay, well, I was the Best Picture winner, but I have nothing to show for it.
Yeah, it's very, very odd. Do we actually want to talk about Driving Miss Daisy, the movie itself?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, not one of my favorite Best Picture winners. Not exactly rated highly for a lot of people, for that matter. I think it's very dated, and just on the surface level, I just want to get this out of the way. The music is annoying to me. Some of the performances, I mean, I get why Jessica Tandy wins. It's a very unlikable character for most of it, but I think she really gets to the heart of like this character at least, so that's good. I mean, it's just the way that it just barely touches on very important subject matter while making it seem like it's more substantial than it is that really bugs me about the movie. So
I kind of agree. I have to say though, I don't hate this movie like a lot of other people do. I know that there is some vitriol towards Driving Miss Daisy. I do recognize that it is trying to tackle very serious subject matter in a lighter tone. And I get why for a lot of people that is just not enjoyable. I do like Jessica Tandy in the film. I think that she, it's not her best performance, but I think she's fun to watch. I love the way that she says "bully." It's this very surface level thing, but I think that her performance is engaging to a point. Morgan Freeman, I actually don't think is very good in this film. I have to say.
I agree.
I think
I feel bad saying it, but like, yeah.
I think that he is a caricature, and oftentimes an offensive caricature.
Yep.
It's pretty bad. I don't think he's very good in this film. I think the only reason to really watch it is because of Jessica Tandy, who is doing a good enough job, but it's not great. I do have to also say I have a soft spot for the music. I know it's super cheesy, so I know it's super, super cheesy and corny, but I would also be lying to you if I did not hum that theme quite often in my life.
Fair enough.
In fact, one of the reasons why I go back and watch Jessica Tandy's Win is because they play that theme music when she's walking up there. I know I'm terrible, but
okay. I
have a soft spot for that cheesy music.
Yeah, well, it clearly appealed to a lot of people. you being one of them, and that's fine. Yeah, I just think it gets to a point when I'm watching the film where I just get frustrated basically at the treatment of the Morgan Freeman character and how we know very little even about him, and also like just the way that he never really confronts her about her very terrible mistreatment of him. Just gets a little bit frustrating to watch over and over. And so I don't know.
Yeah, that scene when it's the Martin Luther King speech that she's going to.
Yes.
And you're just really wanting to get like finally a direct confrontation about these issues. And like they get into it a little bit, but then they just go right past it. And
that's the thing. That's my issue.
It's like you want to yell at the movie. Like, I understand you're trying to be light in tone, but you're being a little too light right now. It's about Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
We kind of have to take this moment with a little bit more seriousness at this point.
Right. So, like I said, not one of my favorites at all. But I just wanted to, before we move on to other movies, do a quick question from Jeffrey Kerr, who asked, do you think Bruce Beresford deserved his Best Director snub for Driving Miss Daisy? If not, which of the actual nominees would you have bumped out for him? For me, I would say that yes, he did deserve the snub. But and I don't know who I would have bumped out. Do you have a different take?
No, it's pretty much in the same regard. I think
Yeah.
that that movie doesn't really deserve to be a Best Picture nominee, and
Right.
also doesn't deserve a director nomination. But I do have to say it, even though it did win Best Picture, that means it is kind of weird that he's not nominated. And if I'm just sort of looking at the whole thing as like, okay, just to sort of make sense in my Oscar history mind, if I had to like put Beresford in and take somebody else out, I think I probably would have removed. I think either Jim Sheridan or Woody Allen. I think I
Yeah.
would have bumped either one of those.
I think
Maybe
I would
Woody
have
Allen.
gone
I
with
think I
Woody
would
Allen
have.
because,
Yeah,
I
think I
mean,
would have taken
first
out
of all, he doesn't even care about the Oscars to begin with.
True.
Also, he has had so many at this point, and it is a good film, but like, yeah,
The direction is not
right.
exceptional. I mean, there's been other movies that because Woody Allen movies also generally don't get talked about for their direction anyway. It's mostly
Right.
an acting and writing showcase. There are some films that are very well directed by him. I don't think Crimes and Misdemeanors is particularly one of them.
Yeah. So let's get to some of these other movies because there's a lot more interesting stuff going on. So the other Best Picture nominees we have are, I would say, very crowd pleasing. Two of them at least: Dead Poets
Mhm.
Society and Field of Dreams, and then the other one being My Left Foot, our big kind of introduction to Daniel Day-Lewis for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So
I didn't really like My Left Foot. I did not like this movie too much.
mhm.
I don't think this movie has aged well at all.
Yeah, it
And
it would have had a lot of think pieces these days.
oh, absolutely. And I think that definitely crosses your mind when you're watching it. You can definitely understand why people were taken with it at the time, but as good as Daniel Day-Lewis is as an actor, there is just something about watching this man who does not have this physical disability try very hard to convince you that he does.
Mhm.
And it just does not come across very well in our modern perspective of performances and the way actors kind of handle that type of stuff. So it's a very strange thing to watch it now, I have to say.
I pretty much agree. Well, yeah, watching it in 2018 is just not ideal, honestly. I mean, for historical purposes, if you want to watch the other performance that Daniel Day-Lewis won an Oscar for, it is a good performance if you just kind of remove some of those outside factors of the fact that this is a guy who is pretending to have cerebral palsy. It's not great. If you can't remove yourself from that, then it just becomes very icky, honestly. But on the surface, you can understand why, because he does really, once again, transform himself, going full method. And I think it's a very good performance from him, regardless of those factors. But at the same time,
Yeah.
does not age well.
It's sort of interesting because it's kind of comparing it to Born on the 4th of July, where
Mm,
that's a movie where, if you don't believe the central performance, then you can't believe the rest of the movie. I kind of feel the same way about My Left Foot. If you can't really buy what Daniel Day-Lewis is trying to accomplish as an actor, then you're never really going to be on board with the film. And back in 1989, when culture was very different about talking, and discussing these types of subjects, you could see how people were really enthused to reward him.
right.
Now it's a little bit more uncomfortable.
Yeah. But Brenda Fricker, I think, is very good. She wins for Best Supporting Actress for playing Christy Brown's mother, very suffering mother type of role that we've seen a lot win this category, but I think is pretty solid in the film. I don't know if it's like totally a earth-shattering performance by any means, but it's one of these things again where I understand why she wins because it is a very sympathetic character.
Yeah, she's not. It's nothing that I would say is worthy of an Oscar, but if you are in love with that movie, she is definitely the emotional heart and soul of that film. And if you're gonna really go over the moon with it, then I could see why you would be very taken with her performance and wanting to reward it.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of emotional heart and soul, Robin Williams, Dead Poets Society.
Yeah. Now, this was actually the one movie I didn't get a chance to rewatch before this
I didn't
show.
either, but I had seen it so many times in the past that I'm like, well, I know what
True.
it
I
is.
had seen it a couple times before, and I have to admit that watching all of these Best Actor nominees again, even though this is the one that is furthest from my memory, it might actually be my preferred winner of this category.
Hmm.
All of these other performances really indulge in very over the top moments
Oh yeah.
for the most part, except Morgan Freeman, who's just bad. But um, Robin Williams is, really being quiet and reserved and having this inner strength, but never having it really like take over him to the point where you just see him losing control. Like he's
Right.
always in
Yeah.
command of what he's doing, and I find that so impressive. And comparing it with all the other performances in this category, like I said, though it's the one that I haven't rewatched recently, comparing it to the ones that I have, it seems so much more impressive to me.
Yeah, for sure. And the movie itself, I think, I mean, it can be cliche if
Oh,
you
absolutely.
can see how, it's the classic sort of how do I teach these kids this sort
Yeah.
of thing. But also, very inspiring, very quotable to a lot of people, which I think is part of why it won Best Original Screenplay, in addition to the fact that it was the only Best Picture nominee in the race. But
Yeah.
regardless,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a very special movie for a lot of people. It was to me when I was just a teenager, especially like, growing up in New England. It's like it feels like, this is the ideal in a sense. But also it's treading into some dark territory, which again I liked as a teenager. It's one of these things I have to revisit again as an adult just to sort of see if a lot of this kind of holds up. But for now, I feel great about it. Who
Yeah,
knows?
it's a really good movie.
Yeah.
It has a very strong emotional core to it, anchored by his performance and just that ensemble of actors too. Just
Oh yeah.
like that whole group of young actors there is just so good.
Very good ensemble. Ethan Hawke, Robert Sean Leonard. A lot of great
Mhm.
performances in that.
Yeah.
Field of Dreams. That is a movie that I think only gets 3 nominations,
Yeah.
which is very low. But it's interesting looking at 89 because I think you juxtapose like Field of Dreams with Steel Magnolias, both of which come out this year, and there are these two like weepy movies that either like the stereotypical men or women get very emotional about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is like the dad emotional movie that men can feel comfortable saying that they cry about. So.
Exactly, and probably is the reason why it ended up getting in. It's a very well received movie, and I have to admit, I kind of scratch my head that this is a Best Picture nominee. It's a good movie,
It's a
but
crowd pleaser.
certainly
Yeah.
it is.
So
But is it like Best Picture worthy material? I don't really think so. It feels strange to me that this is nominated for Best Picture, but like Henry V isn't.
sure. Yeah.
That feels very odd to me. But it's an enjoyable film. Like you said, it's a perfect crowd pleaser. But I don't know if it's one of the 5 best movies of '89.
Probably not. And there are so many great movies in 89 that I feel like I can say with confidence that it's definitely not in the top 5.
Yeah, yeah,
But at the same time, I definitely understand why it happens because, again, this is kind of around the era where the Academy is still wanting to reward movies that do very well financially and are very popular with America. And so I feel like that's kind of more or less the slot for that film.
true. Yeah,
But it is what it is. It's a very, I guess you could just say, pure movie. Like it's not cynical at all. It's just I don't know. It's just not really for me, to be
yeah.
honest.
It's got like a Frank Capra vibe to it.
Yeah. Yep. For sure. Which I can imagine a lot of Academy members are like, yeah, this is good. They don't make them like they used to anymore.
Exactly.
Let's get to one quick question that I found very interesting. This is from H3, and it's at Henry Highstand. He asked, do you think Dead Poets Society deserved to win original screenplay over Do the Right Thing, Crimes and Misdemeanors, and When Harry Met Sally? Such a solid category. Would it win that category today?
Well, when it comes to Do the Right Thing,
Hmm.
I actually think it's really hard to talk about 1989 without talking about Do the Right Thing.
Right. Which we
And
will.
yeah, I don't want to go into too much of it because over at Next Best Picture, I've got a review up of that film. We did a Patreon podcast, so I've talked a
That's
lot
right.
about that film.
Yeah.
So I won't go into too much detail other than to say I think that movie is a masterpiece, and it is an incredible piece of filmmaking. One of the best scripts ever written for film. I think Kim Basinger was totally right to drag everybody
Yes, Queen.
for
I love
not
that.
nominating that movie for Best Picture, as she
Right.
was introducing another Best Picture nominee, which is even crazier.
Yep.
So I think she was totally right. That movie
Absolutely.
deserved more recognition than it got. And I think Dead Poet Society is a very lovely screenplay. It's very, very well done. But when you compare it to the totality of everything that Do the Right Thing is attempting to say, I just don't think there's any contest that should have won the
Right.
award.
I very much agree. Do the Right Thing is absolutely my winner as well. And honestly, I think it would win today. I think it even, we know their relationship with Spike Lee. Hopefully it has evolved enough to this point that, we'll get some nominations for Black Klansman. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing about Do the Right Thing that really is intensified with that conversation about its recognition with the Oscars is that you have this movie that is very much about looking at race from a particular perspective that has a lot of emotion, and it's angry but very expressive in a way that we have never seen before, that is challenging to audiences, especially white audiences at that time. And then you compare it to Driving Miss Daisy, which is very light, and it's like, yeah, it's about racism, but really it's just about these two old people that don't really care so much that there's racism going on in their lives. They're very content with their relationship of employer to employee, and this is the movie that we want to reward, not the one that actually challenges us and is saying something that is very interesting and daring and new. And that juxtaposition really destroys the kind of enjoyment that you can get out of Driving Miss Daisy, I think.
I think that's absolutely true. I do think that is part of why people do not like Driving Miss Daisy, is just the sheer fact that Do the Right Thing was also out in 1989. And despite, it does receive this original screenplay nomination, it also gets supporting actor nomination for Danny Aiello.
For the white guy in the cast.
Yeah, for like the one notable white guy in the cast. It's like, okay, well, I see you, Academy.
Yeah.
But I think to a lot of people, justifiably so, that was definitely not enough. That almost just felt like here you go, you can have a few of these, but it's not like this monumental achievement, which many people even at the time acknowledged it to be. So it's very frustrating.
But Do the Right Thing was also it continues to be very divisive to this day, but even especially when it came out, that movie was dividing people very, very frequently. So it's totally understandable why it isn't a Best Picture nominee, but it's also very regretful that it isn't either.
I agree. So this is actually a wonderful transition in which we can do our Should Have Been a Contender segment. And this is other movies nominated for Oscars or completely not acknowledged by the Academy at all. Any movie that came out in 1989. All right, Josh, let's get into more of these.
Oh man, there's just so many movies in 1989. It's hard to just pick a very limited view of them. But one of the things about 89 that's, I think, very interesting is that that summer of 1989 is really considered one of the best summers for releasing entertainment blockbuster movies. And there's a lot of good stuff in there, but I think the one that sort of rules them all is, I think, Batman.
Yes.
Because Batman is really the film that I think, it didn't establish summer blockbusters at all, but I think it is the one that really showed that comic book adaptations were really something that were going to make a huge amounts of money for studios. And it really feels like a big turning point once Batman comes out. And It's a good movie. I certainly really like it. I prefer Batman Returns,
Mhm.
honestly. I think that is actually the superior film.
Agreed.
But the just total design of that film, I love the art direction of the first Batman film. It's an incredibly looking film, like most of Tim Burton movies are. And it's got a great Jack Nicholson performance as well. It's, I think, the most notable summer release that we had up until that point, and really did a lot to change the industry.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, the sheer fact of it being this popular comic book film, superhero film, made it literally change the course of film history, essentially. So, obviously, a very, very notable film from this year. It does actually win art direction at the
Yes,
Oscars, and that is
deservedly so.
the only nomination that Batman gets, and it does win for art direction. So, a weird little anomaly there.
Yep.
But this brings up a good question from our friend Andrew Carden, who asked Jack Nicholson was pushed hard for an Oscar for Batman, but there was ample category confusion. A lead nomination at the Globes, later supporting over at BAFTA. Do you think he deserved a nomination? And if so, in which category?
I do think he deserved a nomination. I actually think Jack Nicholson is by far the best thing about the first Batman film.
Mm-hmm.
That movie, I do really enjoy it, but I also feel like it's a little mechanical in the way that it's made, which is why I actually prefer the second film, because it just has a lot more energy to it. But all that energy in the first Batman film is provided by Jack Nicholson. I think it is such a memorable performance. It is so fun and energetic, and I am really taken with it.
Yeah.
I do think I would call him supporting in the film, though. I ultimately understand the arguments for having him lead. He's the top billed. He's billed ahead of Michael Keaton.
Billed ahead of Michael Keaton, which will always crack me up.
Yeah, he did get the Globe nomination for lead.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, while he is a huge part of that film, and I think his performance of the Joker in Batman, that character takes up a larger amount of that film than any of the other Jokers in films. I still think that at the end of the day, it's Batman's movie. Mm-hmm. And while Jack Nicholson is a huge looming force in it, I still think he's still there to support the Batman story. So I would nominate him for supporting actor.
Right. And honestly, this is one of the toughest cases for me to crack as far as lead or supporting.
I agree. It is more difficult than you would think.
Yeah. I'm going to say that I would probably do lead for him, actually.
I can totally understand that,
because he has a lot of screen time. He overshadows a lot, including Michael Keaton himself, who is kind of an understated Batman overall. And that's kind of what the character is to begin with. It's hard to really overshadow like all those colorful villains in the Batman universe, of course, but at the same time, I just feel like he looms so large over the whole film and gets scenes to himself. And, I just feel like they're co-leads, honestly. And if I was gonna kick anyone out of lead actor, sorry, but it would probably be Morgan Freeman.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I mean, even we're split on his category placement, so
that's the issue.
So he doesn't get nominated.
Right, yeah. I think he probably was pretty close. I mean, we know the Academy loves Jack Nicholson, and this was a highly publicized campaign and also role for him, so...
Yeah, like one of the most revolutionary deals that he carved out for that movie. He made so much money.
Yeah. So, I don't know. It would have been cool to see that, but it is what it is. It's still iconic. So other movies I would like to mention back to the original screenplay discussion. I love Do the Right Thing, and I think it deserved that original screenplay win over Dead Poets Society. I think it should have gotten that. But I will also say that there's another movie in here that I think was so well written and so iconic that I almost wish it had won too, which is When Harry Met Sally.
Yeah, I have to admit, it has been a very long time since I've seen that movie. I don't remember a whole lot from it, but I do remember it being very fun and very enjoyable. Those performances from Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan are just so good.
Yeah. I feel like it's such an iconic screenplay, and Uh, yeah, I mean, I actually have like a history with it because in college I had a class called interpersonal communication, and pretty much the entire class was based on When Harry Met Sally.
Wow.
Just the different dynamics, the relationships between men and women, how people treat each other, talk to each other, nonverbal communication, all of this I think are so well highlighted in the film. And I really wish that like Meg Ryan had gotten a nomination because she is like so great in that movie.
Yeah, she really should have been nominated. It is a great, great performance from her.
Yeah, probably my favorite performance she's ever given. And Billy Crystal, who is someone I'm hot and cold on generally, I think is also really good. It to me it feels like one of these movies that the Academy should have fallen a little more in love with than it actually did. So it's curious to me.
Yeah, but I guess with as we talked about before, with like Field of Dreams versus Steel Magnolias, you've got these movies that kind of appeal more to the masculine side of emotions and ones that appeal more feminine. And at the time, I think the masculine movies were just going to dominate more.
Yeah, that it makes total sense, but it's just frustrating because I just feel like, if something like As Good as It Gets can get all that Oscar love and two lead acting wins, and I feel like this should have gotten more than it did. But regardless, one of my faves. Two animated movies I wanted to cover from this year are The Little Mermaid, of course, the beginning of the Disney Renaissance, and Kiki's Delivery Service from Hayao Miyazaki.
Yeah, I have to admit, I've not seen the Miyazaki film. Miyazaki's kind of a blind spot for me.
It's okay.
So I'm not too familiar with a lot of his filmography. But of course, I've seen The Little Mermaid. I would actually say that this is one of the rare occasions, I don't know if this might be unpopular, where the song that wins from the movie is actually the best song in the movie.
Yeah.
Because I like the other songs that are in the Disney movies that win, but I think there's always another song that's better. But Under the Sea from Little Mermaid, I think is far and away the best song in that film.
It's a classic.
Yeah. And it very deserving win. I'm glad that we got to see Howard Ashman actually accept the award.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you're going to talk about Howard Ashman and Alan Menken in a few episodes. I have a feeling that's going to come up.
Mm-hmm.
So I really love their duo, and I love seeing them rewarded for such a really wonderful musical kind of variety in that film.
Yeah. Again, this is another movie that really kickstarted a huge trend in film itself of just this Disney Renaissance and these classic Disney musicals, many of them written by Alan Menken with lyrics by Howard Ashman. Yeah, I mean it's iconic. The story is, it's up for debate at this point in our in our history, but I think, Ursula is fantastic. One of my favorite Disney villains.
Yes. Oh, Ursula. I mean, when you have a Disney villain who's modeled after Divine, you can't go wrong.
You cannot go wrong. Yes. And Poor Unfortunate Souls. Why don't we have that nominated? I mean, that's just such a great song. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. Most of the Disney villain songs were never really embraced by the Academy, which is a shame because, I mean, the Disney villains were always my favorite characters in those movies. And
oh, yes, you are talking to the right person because I totally agree.
Yeah, so I would have loved to have seen more recognition for those songs. And yeah, Poor Unfortunate Souls, just the delivery of that song is just so fun.
I mean, that is a performance itself, such personality to it. Yeah, I love it.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, so Kiki's Delivery Service is a wonderful, wonderful Hayao Miyazaki film about this young witch who is going off to sort of find herself. And it's one of these movies where, just like a lot of Miyazaki movies compared to other animated movies, where I'm just like, okay, this is going to get really dark and go really wrong for the character. But really, it's just like a really nice, kind of pleasant experience throughout. And it's not without some of the ugly side that, I talked about Spirited Away. But it's still just this beautiful, beautiful colors, beautiful characterization. And for me, one of the best. So That's that.
Yeah, I have not seen the movie, but of the Miyazaki that I have seen, he's a very gifted storyteller, so that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. And I will just give another nod to Steel Magnolias. I don't think it's the best movie in the world, but it certainly is very funny. It's very emotional. And Julia Roberts is the only person who gets a nomination from this, despite a very large Oscar-friendly cast.
Yeah, it's especially a shame that like Sally Field didn't get it, because I mean she has that scene at the very end when she breaks down, and it's just so heartbreaking, but funny at the same time. It manages to play both of those emotions very well, and it doesn't feel like whiplash when you're watching it, and she's so good in the film too.
Yeah, exactly. And I love Shirley MacLaine in this movie. She is just ridiculous. Just like hating everyone. It's so
yeah, it's such a great ensemble. That's one of those movies that, had SAG been around at that time, that definitely would have been up for best ensemble.
Yeah, that would have been interesting if we had a SAG ensemble for this year, because we got this, and Dead Poets Society, probably even Do the Right Thing.
Yeah.
That would have been a tough competition.
Yeah, there would have been a lot of great entries for a category like that. I also just wanted to mention that Michael Moore's documentary Roger and Me came out this year. And personally, I think this is his best movie.
Ooh.
And I know that currently Michael Moore is sort of a little much to take in. And even in looking at Roger and Me, you certainly see many of the kind of styles, and you might even say tricks, that he employs that he would use later on. But Roger and Me, personally, is the movie that I think has the most genuine emotion to it, because it's talking about a subject matter that directly impacts his community. And so I really am taken to Roger and Me. I think that is his strongest work as a filmmaker, and while it certainly has a lot of the stuff that he has shown in his later films, I really do enjoy that movie. I think it is his best film.
Fair enough. I actually haven't seen it, so I definitely need to.
It's good. I do enjoy. I mean, it's a Michael Moore documentary for sure. But
yes, of course.
I think it is. I think comparing it to his later films is very interesting because, like I said, this one talks about the closing of the GM plant that directly impacted the people of Michigan. And I don't think he gets bogged down so much in the grander political themes. It feels much more focused than his other movies tend to feel.
Yeah, I can imagine that. That sounds good. Yeah, I'll definitely have to check that one out. So what else? Well, I really like the Fabulous Baker Boys.
Really
like the Michelle Pfeiffer performance. And that is a very noteworthy thing, because she pretty much sweeps all of the critics' prizes for that year, including New York, Los Angeles, I think National Society of Film Critics too. So she really is like a clear critics' favorite, and she is the person that people were comparing Willem Dafoe to in the Florida Project last year, because he was in the same boat of just like sweeping all of these major critics for supporting actor, and she did for lead actors for the Fabulous Baker Boys, where
she even won the Globe.
Yeah, she wins the Globe for drama, so she's already like right in front. Seems like she's going to be the clear favorite, and it's also like a role that I think we've come to see the Academy has an appreciation for, kind of just this young, attractive starlet having a real bold character sort of thing, but it doesn't end up happening. Goes to the veteran, which is obviously the other major thing that they love in that category.
Yeah, it's one of those examples where the critics have their say about what they think is the best, but when you hand it off to the industry, they're just like, well, we want to reward the person who's been working for decades and probably won't get another chance like this again.
Right. Yeah.
Which is a shame when you consider Michelle Pfeiffer's Oscar career, because it sort of seems like that was her only chance.
This seemed like her
my fingers, though.
Yeah, and that's even when people were like hoping that she could get in for Mother, despite the subject matter of that. I mean, yeah, she's very, very overdue.
Yes.
But yeah, I feel like maybe voters were thinking like, oh, just is this hot actress who's gonna keep getting these great roles, and we're just going to keep nominating her. Eventually she's going to win. She'll be fine. Her time will come. And then I'm like, we're still waiting.
Yeah, you
But-
still want to have hope, but
Yeah.
it's not looking great. But but I have confidence at least she'll still get work. So that's good.
For sure. Crimes and Misdemeanors, I really like. That's a movie I actually watched in my film studies class in high school, and I appreciated my teacher for picking that one. Very mature theme. It didn't go over too well for like my classmates, again, who I have referenced before as being, thinking that's just kind of this fun little elective thing, but still very good, very complicated, very dark.
Yeah. Now, this was actually a movie that I had seen for the first time very recently, and it is good. I enjoyed it. But Martin Landau, I would not call a supporting actor in that film.
Right.
He feels like the main character, to be honest. And I know the narrative is sort of split between him and Woody Allen's character in that film, which, by the way, I don't know if you remember this, but Woody Allen's character has a niece in that film who dresses like Annie Hall.
Oh, yeah.
It's a little uncomfortable to watch now. But regarding Martin Landau, he feels like the central figure of which this story really revolves around, and I can understand pushing him supporting, but I really feel like he's a lead in that film.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't really explain it. I mean, and even Alan Alda, he got a lot of praise for this role, including some critics' prizes for it. But I definitely actually remember him the most from watching it. So good ensemble, absolutely.
Oh yeah, there's a very good collection of actors, which Woody Allen
always
used to not have that problem.
Yeah.
Getting good actors to work with him used to be something that came very naturally to him and his film. So all the cast members in this are great.
Yeah, absolutely. One other one that I just wanted to mention is not necessarily an Oscar-friendly movie by any means, but is another one that's a favorite in my family, which is National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation.
I have to admit, I'm not the biggest Chevy Chase fan. But,
I mean, he's a terrible person. But
but I do think that of the vacation movies that he was a part of, I think this is the strongest one for sure.
It is. It very much is. The other three are just not good at all, in my opinion. This one, something about it, I mean, it's cliche as hell and pretty stupid and pretty broad, but at the same time, it just has a sentimental value for me that just kind of works. And it's one of those movies that we just kind of, whenever I go home, we just watch at Christmas time, and it's just kind of nice and nostalgic. So
oh yeah, absolutely. I totally get that. Sometimes you just need those types of movies in your life.
Yeah. So did you have any more that you wanted to talk about here? I'm sure we're going to leave something out that someone's going to get upset about.
I actually did have a couple more. Well, speaking of nostalgia, one that I would just throw out is Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Which, again, it's not, I would never call that a great movie, but certainly I remember watching that on VHS when I was younger and just really loving that film. And the art direction of that film is also just amazing. The way they have to reconfigure everything to make it so much larger. So I like that film. It's more of a nostalgic pick, but I find it enjoyable. Another movie from that year that I really like is War of the Roses.
Nice.
It's not, I wouldn't say it's like a surreal film, but it is very much has these fantastical elements where you watch this marriage fall apart between characters played by Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner, and it's directed by Danny DeVito, and it's just so fun. It's just such an enjoyably fun movie to watch, and it's a great companion piece also to Romancing the Stone, which is another favorite movie of mine. So I kind of like thinking of those two movies as like the happy times and the bad times.
Right.
So I really enjoy War of the Roses. And then the only other movie that I would mention, because as you said, there's so many movies in '89 that you could mention, but the last one I'll talk about is not an Oscar movie at all, but because I am a giant James Bond fan, I would feel guilty if I did mention this. License to Kill came out.
Mm-hmm.
It's not one of the best Bond films, but it's really enjoyable. I think Timothy Dalton is very solid as James Bond. The score to this film by Michael Kamen, I think, is really good. And in that whole, was another one that came out in that whole summer of '89 that really just shows you how strong of a selection those movies were. So I'm a Bond fan. I got to mention License to Kill. I'm obligated to do so.
There you go. I just want to mention one very notable one. Speaking of kind of popular nostalgic films, Back to the Future Part 2. So that is one that is a favorite of many people's, a least favorite of others, but definitely the one that's in the middle for me.
Yeah.
So that's where I fall.
What's actually just sort of a quick side note about Back to the Future for me, I actually saw Back to the Future Part 3 before I saw Part 2.
Oh my.
So
Okay.
all the references that they have in the third movie to the second film, I had no idea what they were talking about.
That's amazing.
But Part 2, I think in some circles it is kind of looked at as like the lesser of the three movies, but it's enjoyable. It's still fun.
It's Biff. We're living out a simulation right
Yeah.
now. So anyway, but just a quick question on the on speaking of sort of popular films. This comes from actually multiple people, I think, but Joe Armando said, do you think had they not given him the award for The Untouchables, there would have been a push to give Sean Connery supporting actor for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade?
I think there would have been a push. I mean, he did get the Globe nomination for supporting actor, so it was certainly in the ether.
In the hunt. Yep.
I don't know if that necessarily would have translated, because even the first Indiana Jones film, even though it did get nominated for picture and director, it didn't have any acting nominations with it either.
Right.
And all the sequels have never gotten anywhere close to that kind of Oscar success. I think that he would have been celebrated, certainly. I think people would have thought, yeah, he was really good in the film. I don't know if that necessarily would have translated to a nomination for this particular movie. Maybe giving him some juice later for something else to come down the line. I think it would have helped the cause. I don't know if he would have won for this movie.
Yeah, I think he's very good, and I feel like it is like a classic sort of sentimental role there, but I just don't know if it would have materialized for that movie.
Yeah. Plus, him getting nominated at the Globes for that film is a very Golden Globes thing to do.
Globe's gonna globe.
Yes.
Yeah, just so many incredible films. A lot have not been mentioned. I'm sorry in advance. But
Not yell at us because we didn't mention the dozen other movies that were also great from this year.
Yeah, Cinema Paradiso, Glory, all sorts of great films.
The Abyss.
Yep, absolutely. Parenthood, sure.
Sex, Lies, and Videotapes. Like, we know there's a ton of other movies from this year. Don't yell at us.
Don't yell at me specifically, please. Don't come into my mentions.
No.
Anyway, so, there you have it. So when we come back, we'll be giving our final verdict as to whether we think Driving Miss Daisy deserved Best Picture, or maybe if Born on the 4th of July truly deserved it.
The nominees for Best Picture are
Born on the 4th of July, A. Kitman Ho and Oliver Stone, producers.
Dead Poets Society, Stephen Haft, Paul Younger-Witt, and Tony Thomas, producers.
Driving Miss Daisy, Richard D. Zanuck and Lily Finney Zanuck, producers.
Field of Dreams, Lawrence Gordon and Charles Gordon, producers.
My Left Foot, Noel Pearson, producer.
And the Oscar goes to... yeah, that's good.
Driving Miss Daisy, Richard D. Zanuck, Lily Finney Zanuck.
And we're back. So now we're going to be giving our final verdict as to whether Driving Miss Daisy deserved that Best Picture win, or if Born on the 4th of July deserved it more. So Josh Parham, what do you say?
Well, even though we have talked about some of the things of Born on the 4th of July that could have been better and improved upon, I think if you compare it to Driving Miss Daisy, it's pretty clear that Born on the 4th of July is a better movie than that.
Mhm.
Outside of just the problematic messages of Driving Miss Daisy, Born on the 4th of July, I think, is just an overall stronger film. It's got stronger performances. The direction is, actually like being applied to something that is engaging. And even though the story kind of lets it down a little bit, I just think as a piece of filmmaking, it has more resonance with an audience than Driving Miss Daisy does. It certainly is a movie that I would want to watch over Driving Miss Daisy again, even though Driving Miss Daisy is like 90 minutes and Born on the 4th of July is well over 2 hours, almost 2.5. To me, that is still a better film to watch than Driving Miss Daisy. It's not my favorite movie of '89, but I think especially if you compare these two movies, Born on the 4th of July is the stronger film and should have won Best Picture over it.
I think that I agree. And if I look at specifically the Best Picture nominees of this year, I think I would have struggled a bit between Born on the 4th of July and Dead Poets Society, because I think they're both very good films and they both have some issues in some ways. I think probably, ironically, it would be like a sentimental thing for me, just like Academy voters were for Driving Miss Daisy, and I would have picked Dead Poets Society. But between Driving Miss Daisy and Born on the 4th of July, for me, absolutely no contest. Born on the 4th of July would have been my pick. It would be a deserving film. I would have understood why it won if Driving Miss Daisy wasn't even in the race. And I think Driving Miss Daisy is just very dated and problematic and just not something that will hold through the course of time. And even to like what Born on the 4th of July does, which does feel like at times very 80s/90s feeling, but I think still is a film that you can enjoy on that level today. So
I agree. Like we said, Born on the 4th of July certainly is not without its own issues and deficiencies, but it works overall in trying to tell a particular story much better than its main competition in Driving Miss Daisy does.
Right. Having said that, I would have voted for Do the Right Thing as a write-in vote.
Exactly. Like looking at this Best Picture lineup, like there are good movies in here, but I do look at it and just think, well, all these movies are also a very distant second to Do the Right Thing.
Exactly.
So it sort of doesn't matter who I would pick out of these nominees because the very best movie out of this bunch of this year is not nominated.
Exactly. And I didn't really get to my thoughts as much earlier, but I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's a directorial achievement. And the fact that he's not even nominated is a real shame. And I understand it because he's very outspoken. He is who he is. He says these things, and a majority older white male Academy gets very nervous about it. I understand just the dynamics at play here. But when you look at it, it's such a singular vision, so influential, so wrapping up the totality of this experience that we haven't seen much in mainstream film up to that point. And I just feel like it's got to be one of the biggest mistakes that the Academy has made, was just virtually completely overlooking that movie. So that's it.
I 100% agree.
Great. So thank you, Josh, for coming on with me. This was very comprehensive and a lot of fun.
Oh, absolutely. I loved this. I hope I can do it again sometime.
Yeah. So tell the people where they can find you on the internet.
You can find me on Next Best Picture, where I write reviews and am usually on the podcast over there. We've got a great team there. I would recommend you support them. And you can also find me on Twitter at @JRParham.
There you go. And you can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. And you can find the podcast at Oscar Runner Up. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts /iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. Rate, review, subscribe. And now I'll leave it up to you listening at home to decide between whether Driving Miss Daisy deserved to win or if Born on the 4th of July deserved to win. I have a feeling I will get getting a lot of people who just say, why can't I vote for another movie? So regardless, you can do that at filmtrophies.com, or you can email me at filmtrophies@gmail.com. So once again, thank you, Josh.
Well, thank you.
And I will bid you all adieu.